Today, I'm going to show you how to install Proxmox virtual environment onto a machine, take your existing Home Assistant installation, move it to this new virtual environment with less than 5 minutes downtime. And it's actually much easier than you might think. So hang around. Hi, and welcome to Resin Chem Tech. Now, I've been running Home Assistant on Proxmox for almost 3 years now. And probably like most of you, I started out running on a Raspberry Pi. But as Home Assistant grew bigger and became more of an important integrated part of our smart home, I wanted something that with a little more power, a little quicker, and something that was a little more reliable than the Raspberry Pi. So in today's video, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the why use Proxmox. I'll talk about the hardware that you need, and then we'll get into a step-by-step guide of how to install Proxmox, and more importantly, how to move your existing Home Assistant over to Proxmox with only a few minutes downtime. Now, as always, there'll be links here along the timeline and down in the video description. Also check the video description for links to anything else that I talk about. Now, this is not going to be a full Proxmox tutorial. There are plenty of online sources if you want to learn the ins and outs of Proxmox, but I will show you what you need to know to run Home Assistant and be able to create backups of your virtual machine should something go catastrophically wrong. So why run Home Assistant on Proxmox? There are a number of good reasons. For one, it lets you run a much more powerful hardware, meaning Home Assistant and Home Assistant restarts will be much quicker. Next, you can use the same machine that you're running Home Assistant on for other purposes by simply spinning up and creating additional VMs. There is no micro SD card here or a required external USB drive. That helps eliminate additional points of failure. Proxmox gives you the ability to create a backup of the entire machine, not just the Home Assistant configuration. There's also the ability to take what are called snapshots, quick point-in-time captures that you can easily restore back to a particular point in time. Proxmox is open source and the community version is completely free, no licensing or subscription required. And finally, with some additional hardware I won't be covering in this video, but maybe in a later video, it's possible to create what's called high availability failover for Home Assistant. That means if the server itself actually goes down, another server will automatically restart Home Assistant with little to no downtime. Okay, let's move on to take a look at what kind of hardware do you need to run Home Assistant on Proxmox. As far as the hardware is concerned, you might be surprised to learn that it doesn't take a lot of horsepower to be able to run Proxmox. Now, there are a couple of important items. First of all, it must be a 64-bit processor, either Intel or AMD, and that processor must have virtualization support. That means for Intel processors, it must be capable of Intel VT, and for AMD processors, that means AMD-V. You can usually find those settings in the BIOS, and you might be surprised how many even lower-end processors, like Celeron, actually support virtualization. You may well have an old machine sitting around home that is perfectly capable of running Proxmox. Now, in terms of RAM, Proxmox itself needs 1 to 2 gig. So a lot of your hardware specs are going to be based on the quantity and types of VMs you expect to run. Right now, we're going to focus primarily on just running Home Assistant on this particular server. If you wanted to start adding other things, you would need to add more RAM and potentially a better processor along the way. But to run Home Assistant, you really need only 4 gig of RAM. I would recommend at least 8 gig of RAM and very little hard drive space. Proxmox doesn't need more than a couple of gig. Home Assistant will be creating a 32 gig partition. So even if you have something with only 120 gig hard drive in it, that's perfectly acceptable. You'll be able to run Home Assistant, and if you've got the RAM and processor, even run additional VMs alongside that. The one other thing that you do have to have here, though, is you do need an Ethernet connection or a network card. Now, while it's theoretically possible to run Proxmox over Wi-Fi, in fact, I'm going to use a laptop here for my test install. Proxmox doesn't come with the Wi-Fi libraries built in. You would have to add those after the fact, and it's really just not recommended to run something like Proxmox over Wi-Fi. So I'm going to say that while technically you get away without it, you do want an Ethernet connection or network card in your machine. So you don't need a lot of horsepower. In fact, something like this, which I'm not necessarily recommending, but something like this, which is under $200, will run Home Assistant just fine. And at today's cost of a Raspberry Pi, especially by the time you add in a power supply and an SSD and maybe an external USB drive and a case, you're going to be really close to this cost already. Now, what I'm going to install on today, I actually am stepping up again from my i3 just because I'm starting to run more VMs and that kind of stuff. So let's take a look at the machine we're going to install on today. It's basically a mini PC, and it's going to be my first time of using an AMD, but I'm going to be using an AMD Ryzen 5 as the processor in here. When we first set this up, we're going to have to hook up a monitor and a keyboard to install Proxmox. Once that's done, we can remove that. We're going to run this headless and access everything via web browser. So we really don't care about the graphics or the video or audio output on this, but it does have 16 gig of RAM. It has a 512 gigabyte SSD inside. It does have an expansion slot, so just for the heck of it, I'm going to add a 480 gig SSD into it. Don't really need it, but it gives me plenty of additional storage. It does have plenty of USB ports. It has 2 USB-C ports on the front and numerous USB-A ports on the back, plus our network connection. That's going to give us plenty if we need to add any kind of dongles for things like Zigbee or Z-Wave. This is more than enough horsepower to run Home Assistant and possibly a couple of other VMs. It's pretty much going to be my dedicated Home Assistant machine. And my total cost of this with a coupon at the time was about $330, and that's all in power supply and everything. And finally, there's one piece of hardware that we're going to need, and we're only going to need this temporarily, and that is a USB thumb drive that has at least 2 gig of capacity on it. We're going to need this to install Proxmox. Once we're done with that, we no longer need the USB thumb drive. So with all the hardware out of the way, let's get started on downloading and installing Proxmox on this new machine. So the first thing we have to do is we have to download Proxmox. So I'm going to go to the Proxmox downloads website. We want to download the Proxmox virtual environment. You'll see this abbreviated as PVE a lot. We want to grab an ISO image, and then we're going to download the ISO installer. We'll save that. So our next step, now that we have that image downloaded, is we need to flash that onto our USB thumb drive. I'm using a utility called Etcher, but you can use anything that will flash an ISO image onto a USB drive and make it bootable. I'm going to flash from file, so I'm just going to select that file that I just downloaded. Now I'm going to select the target. Everything on the target is going to be overwritten. Now it's showing me that my E, which is my only USB drive, so I'm going to go ahead and select that. And now I'm ready to flash. Okay, we're now done. Now we're ready to eject this thumb drive, and we're going to take it over to our target machine. Now, before we can install Proxmox, there is a couple things I need to check and make sure that are set properly on my particular new server. So you need to get into your BIOS, and your BIOS, how you get into it and what it looks like is going to be different, but you should find similar options. The first thing I need to do is I need to come down and verify that virtualization is enabled. So in my case, this is this setting here, and we can see that virtualization is enabled for the CPU. The next thing we need to check is the boot order. We need to be able to boot off the USB drive first before it tries to boot off the hard drive so that we can install Proxmox. So I just need to come down here and set my boot order so that the USB device is ahead of the internal hard drive. With that done, we can save and exit, and we're ready to install Proxmox. Now, one other thing I like to do, and this is entirely optional, I'm going to go ahead and give that server a fixed IP address. And again, your router settings are going to look different than mine. But you can see I've already got my first 2 Proxmox servers assigned to 0.15 and 0.16. So I'm going to go over and find the new Proxmox server. And there it is there. And I'm going to go ahead and map a static IP address to 1.7 for that. And just consistency in the name here. I'm going to go ahead and assign that, so even when I install Proxmox, I will already know the IP address of the server. This has nothing to do with the IP address of any VMs that you can create. This is actually just the server itself. I've now inserted that USB key with Proxmox into the server, and I've booted up off the thumb drive. And this is the Proxmox welcome screen. You can see it's version 7.3, which is the most recent stable release as the time of this recording. So now we can simply use the arrow keys on our keyboard, and we simply want to select Install Proxmox VE. Now do note this is going to wipe out everything that's on the hard drive on this current machine, so make sure that this is what you truly want to do. So we'll hit that, and it'll begin loading some files up for us. Okay, at this point it's going to pop up the license agreement. Again, this is going to be the community version. Come down here, agree to the license agreement. Now we need to select a hard drive. In some cases, you may only have one. Remember, I put that second SSD drive in there. I am going to install this to the primary. So just one quick note here, that if you're just going to run one Proxmox server for Home Assistant, maybe a couple other VMs, accepting the defaults here is fine. But if, like me, you want to be able to do replication amongst multiple Proxmox servers and you want to be able to set up high availability failover, you do have to come in here and change the format to ZFS. ZFS is required for replication in Proxmox. And again, this is not a Proxmox tutorial, so I'm not going to get into the details, but it does require RAID. I'm not going to use the second disk because it's just RAID 0. I'm also going to make some changes here in terms of the boot size partition so I can use the rest of the disk space for a few other things. Again, check out the Proxmox tutorials if you want to know more about that. Just know that you need to have ZFS if you want to be able to do replication, and that ZFS does take additional RAM in your system, so you do need to make sure you have enough RAM. The official recommendation for that is a minimum of 4 gig plus an additional gig per terabyte of hard drive space. So with 16 gigs on all my machines, for what I'm planning on running, I should have plenty of RAM to be able to run ZFS and do replication. And click Next. Again, I need to select your country, and time zone is very important here, so do make sure that you select the proper time zone. I'm in Eastern time zone. Now I need to set up a password. This is a password at the server level. So I will enter in a password that I'm going to use for this server, and then an email address. This can be used for Proxmox to email you if there's any kind of problems, say a backup fails or some problem like that. And choose Next. This is a screen where we set up our network connection. I do need to give it a host name. I called my other ones Proxmox 1 and Proxmox 2, so I'm simply going to call this one Proxmox 03. And I do need to add the .local in there for a fully qualified name. Now I need to add the IP address. Again, this is for the server. Since I went ahead and assigned a static IP address before, it actually picked that up from my DNS server. So in my case, the IP address, gateway, and DNS server here are just fine. So I can go ahead and click Next, but of course you need to set whatever IP address you want for your server. Okay, so now it's finally going to ask me to confirm. This is kind of the last step before it's going to reformat that hard drive, and it is going to automatically reboot the system after it's done and should bring up the Proxmox interface. And we're ready to click Install. Now the amount of time that this takes will vary somewhat depending upon the speed of your machine. In my case, for this particular server, the entire part of this install took somewhere around 3 minutes, give or take a little bit. So for the purpose of this video, we'll just go ahead and speed that up to about 5 times normal speed. But the best part here is go get yourself a cup of coffee, take a break, and let the install run until it's complete. So now it's brought up the option to reboot, but the one thing to note on here, if you saw that quickly, was the IP address. As soon as this reboots, we're going to be able to go to that IP address in a web browser. You need to make sure you remove the USB key so it doesn't try to boot off of that. I could go back to the BIOS again and reset that boot order. Okay, once we see that login, the system is now up and running. We no longer need the keyboard and mouse connected to the server. From this point forward, we can go to the IP address listed there, which you see is .17 with a port of 8006. So we will switch over to a browser and do everything else with Proxmox from there. So one little side note, you do need to use HTTPS in your browser as part of the IP address, and you're probably going to see this kind of warning. Now, it's no big deal. It's just saying that Proxmox has its own self-signed certificate, so therefore it doesn't match what the browser is expecting. You actually can fix that if you want to go out and get your own cert and install that into Proxmox, but we're going to go ahead and move forward. And here is the main login screen to Proxmox. Again, we're running off of a browser on a separate computer now. We're no longer on the server. And our default username here is root, and it's going to be the password we set up during installation. And we're going to enter that. Now, notice that we're going to get this little nag message about not having a valid subscription. Again, we're using the community source, so this is perfectly legal. And we're actually going to take care of this here in a second with a special script. But you could actually go out and purchase a subscription that comes with support if you want. For now, we're just going to dismiss that. So this is the main Proxmox interface. Again, this is not meant to be a Proxmox tutorial, So I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, really just kind of what you need to install Home Assistant. But over here, we'll see our data center, and we see a single server because I don't have any servers in clusters. I'm just going to see the one. If I select the server, I can see some general information here. 16 gigs of RAM. I've got a hard drive space. I can see some memory usage. But the first thing we want to do here, since this is a brand new install, we want to go out to updates. Since this is a brand new install, it's not showing any updates available. It probably hasn't populated yet. So we're simply going to click refresh. Again, I'm going to get this no subscription nag message, but that's okay. And it's going to go out and look for any updates that are available. Now it's going to end with a task error because, again, I don't have a subscription key to get the enterprise level repositories for Proxmox, but I'm still able to get all of the other updates that are available for the operating system. So there's everything that's available. I do recommend you go ahead and click upgrade on those, and we will run an upgrade of the underlying operating system. Okay, the update's done. And so we will exit out of the shell here. And it's always a good idea, again, after applying updates, to go ahead and reboot the server. So there's a simple reboot button right up here. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to reboot the server, and we'll come back when that's done. Okay, our reboot is complete, and you can tell that by watching down here for the message starting all VMs and containers. You might need to refresh the page to be able to see that, and you also notice we no longer have any updates available. So at this point, we're ready to install Home Assistant. Now, in my case, since my Home Assistant's already on Proxmox, I could just take a backup of that VM and restore it onto this server and be done. But that's not going to be the case for most of you, so we're going to go through the process of running a couple of scripts to create a Home Assistant VM and restore your Home Assistant backup onto this new VM. And thanks to an individual called T-Texter, who has created a script, all we've got to do is run a script to create our Home Assistant instance. And to do that, we're going to follow this written guide. I'll leave a link to this down in the video description. But the first part of this just talks about installing Proxmox, which is the steps we just went through. Now, section 2 is updating Proxmox. What this script's going to do is going to get rid of that annoying nag message about not having a subscription, and it's going to change our Proxmox over to point at all the community source. So we're going to go ahead and run this script to take care of that before we install Home Assistant. And it's very easy. We're just simply going to copy this script. We're going to come over here and make sure our server is selected. We're going to choose shell. And all we've got to do is paste that script in there and execute it. So now it's going to prompt us for a few things. Do we want to run the script? Yes, we do. We do want to disable the enterprise repository since we don't have a subscription. It's going to take care of that for us. Now what it's going to do is going to add the correct Proxmox sources for our community version. And we want to enable the no subscription repository, yes. Now in my case, do you want to add the beta or test repositories? In this case, I'm going to select no, I don't really want the beta test. I do want to disable that subscription nag. And now it's going to go ahead and run another update, but in this case, it's actually going to update the underlying Proxmox files that we couldn't get to before because we didn't have a subscription to the enterprise repository. So go ahead and run that. And this is going to take a few minutes because once again, it's going to go out, install the updated files for Proxmox, and then it's going to reboot the server. So we'll come back when that's complete. Okay, we're now updated. That script is completed. The server's rebooted, and now we're pointed at the community sources. And from this point forward, should no longer see that nag message. Now we're on to the part about installing Home Assistant. I want to stop here for a second because you need to consider a couple of things here. First, do you need to keep the same IP address for Home Assistant? In my case, that's critical because I'm running the MQTT add-on. And so if my IP address for Home Assistant changes, my IP address for MQTT Broker is going to change, and it's going to mess up a lot of devices. So I want to keep the same IP address. There's a couple ways we can do this. One is to clone the MAC address. The other one would be to go to our router, take the new MAC address, and point it back at the original IP address. But in either case, it's going to require that we shut down the old version of Home Assistant before we start the new one, because we can't have identical MAC addresses or IP addresses at the same time on the network. The way I'm going to opt to do it is going to be to minimize the downtime of Home Assistant. I'm going to do this so Home Assistant only goes down for, should be less than 5 minutes. Installing Home Assistant is just as easy as running that other script. All we've got to do is we've got to copy this script, Now, some people say you shouldn't just run bash scripts without knowing what they're doing. If you are concerned, you can go out to GitHub. You can see exactly what this script is doing. We've copied that. Once again, we're going to go to our server. We're going to go to our shell, and we're going to paste that script in, and we're going to execute it. Now, this is going to install the full Home Assistant OS. If you just want to install something like Core, there are other scripts that will do that. But in this case, we're installing the full Home Assistant OS. Ask if we want to create a new Home Assistant VM. Yes, we do. I'm going to go over to advanced settings because there are a couple things in here I do want to change. Default settings, I believe, will create a give you 4 gig of RAM, 2 cores. We're going to go ahead. Yes, we want to install the stable version of that. Now, I do want to change my virtual machine ID by default. The first VM is always going to be 100, and they'll increment by there. But I'm eventually going to cluster these together, so I need each one to have a unique virtual machine ID. Since this is Proxmox 3, I'm going to give this one 103. Okay, default machine type is fine. I do want to change the host name. I'm just going to use a host name of HASIO 3 for this one. I have 2 CPU cores, is fine. I have 4 available on this. No, I have 6 available on this machine, I believe. I am going to change the RAM. It comes up to default 4 gigs. Since I've got 16 available, I'm going to go ahead and give mine 8 gig of RAM. You can always change this later. The default bridge is fine. Now, here's where if I wanted to go ahead and clone a MAC address from my current production version over to here, I would get the same IP address. I'm going to go ahead and let it use this random one now so we can restore Home Assistant. Then I'll change the MAC address to keep the same IP address. I do not have a VLAN. Blank's default for that. It's fine. I'm going to say I do not want it to start the VM when it's complete because I just want to be able to take a look at it and show you a few things before we do start it up. And we are ready to create the VM. So it's going to run the script here, and what it's going to do is actually going to go out to the official Home Assistant source, and it's going to download the current version of Home Assistant or the Home Assistant OS, and it's going to install that and create the VM for us. So this is going to take a few minutes. We will let that run, and we will come back in a second. Okay, the script is now completed. It has created our VM for us. We can see it already listed over here, and again, we have a ID number of 103 on here, and notice that it's grayed out because it's currently stopped. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at that. And we'll take a look here real quick at the summary. Now, the VM is currently stopped and not running, but we have allocated it 2 CPUs. We've allocated 18 gig of RAM, and it did create a 32 gig partition, which is pretty much normal like you would run on your Raspberry Pi. So installing Home Assistant was really that easy. Now, again, this is not running, but just to give you an idea, this is my current production Home Assistant, and it is still up and running just fine. So now let's go ahead and start this instance. Temporarily, it means we're going to have 2 versions of Home Assistant running simultaneously, but they are going to have different IP addresses. So all we've got to do to start this up is we're going to click on Start. And if we really want to see what's happening, we can go over here to the console, can watch it start to boot up here for Home Assistant. This is not necessary to do, but just kind of let you know when Home Assistant is up and running. So we'll let that finish running. Doesn't really take that long, especially on decent hardware here. Okay, we've got the prompt. That basically means Home Assistant is already started up. I do want to note the IP address here of .224 because I'm going to need that. That's not my normal Home Assistant production version, but that's what we're going to use temporarily. So we need to go to 192.168.1.224 in a browser. I went to that IP address with a port of 81234, which is the default for Home Assistant, and you can see it's bringing up the initial login or setup of Home Assistant. Now, if this is your first Home Assistant install, enter in a username, password, and you're off and running. But what we want to do is we want to restore from a previous backup. Now, if you're using something like Google Drive as your backup, you can simply go out there and download your latest backup, or you can, since your production system is still up, you can go create a backup right now. You just need to make it reachable. And so I'm going to go to my downloads, and here's my backup from last night. I'm going to select that. And again, I do want to restore the full backup. So I'm going to go ahead and click Restore. And again, it's going to wipe anything that's currently in Home Assistant, but of course, there's nothing there yet. So we're going to go ahead and click Restore. And this is going to take a few minutes. It's kind of weird because it doesn't give you any kind of indication that anything is really happening. So you just need to be just a bit patient here while it restores that backup. Okay, once the backup is restored, this screen will show up again. Be a little bit patient. It'll seem like nothing is happening, and it's a little bit scary at first, but eventually once the restore does finish up, go ahead, log in here with my credentials to my old production system. Check the box to keep me logged in, and I'm going to log in. And there's my Home Assistant restored. Now, since I have a different IP address and I have a lot of MQTT devices, there are going to be a lot of things in here right now that aren't working correctly. But that's what we're going to fix next, and we're actually going to now move off of our old production system onto this new production system. Okay, now I'm ready to move that IP address from the old production box to this new one. Now, there are a couple of different ways to do that. The easiest way is just to go into your router, release the original IP address from the old MAC address and assign to this one. I'm not going to do it that way. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to clone the MAC address from the current production box to this one. The reason I'm doing that, now that does require that I have to shut down the old one before I can bring the new one up. Part of the reason I'm doing that is if I have any kind of problems with this instance, that old one is still sitting there, I can stop this one and spin that old one back up and not have to mess around with MAC addresses or IP addresses. Okay, to do that, I'm first going to stop this current new instance of Home Assistant. So I'm just going to right click on that and I'm going to choose shut down. It's going to ask me to confirm that, and we're going to shut down this instance. That will take just a second or two. While that's doing that, I'm going to go over here to my actual production instance of Home Assistant. I'm going to select that. I'm going to come down to the hardware, go to the network, edit that, and I'm going to copy this MAC address. So I now have that copied. So I can move my production back out of the way. Okay, we now see this stopped. So once again, I'm going to select that. I'm going to go to hardware. I'm going to go to my network. I'm going to edit, and I'm going to paste that same MAC address in there. Now, at this point, what I need to do is I need to stop the production instance, and as soon as it stops, I can restart the new instance. And just to keep an eye on how long IP address is down, well, let's just run a little ping here. So we will start pinging the production instance. 108 is my IP address for that. So we'll just start that ping, and we're going to come over here to this now, and let's stop our production instance of Home Assistant. So we're going to shut that down. As soon as we see that that has shut down and stopped pinging, and it takes a few minutes for the shutdown. Okay. It is now stopped. We see the request is timed out. So now we can come over here and we can start our new instance. Bring that back up so we can see. It's going to take a few minutes for this to start up. But when it does start up, the router should give it the original IP address. And again, I like to just take a look at the console as this is starting up. Bring our ping back up. There we go. Okay, we can now see that we've already got our ping going on over here and it's running. So we have now switched from the old production server to the new one. We should be able to go to the IP address in a browser and everything should be running just like it was before. And here we are. This is logged back into the original IP address, but this is now running on the new Proxmox box instead of the old one. And we can see that everything is there, is working. All of our MQTT entities have been resolved. In fact, even if we come over and look at our logs, we'll see that our logs are empty. Basically, it's exactly what we had running before, but now we're running under Proxmox, and in my case, running on the new Proxmox server. Just a quick glance to go back to take a look at our hardware here. We can see that right now Home Assistant is only using 2.7, well, now just around 5% of the two CPUs and is only using about 20% of the memory. Now that will bounce around a little bit, but now we are running on much more powerful hardware, so Home Assistant is going to be more robust and quicker and definitely faster on restarts. Now there's one last thing I want to cover somewhat quickly. One of the big advantages of running on a VM or in Proxmox is the ability to do a full VM backup of the machine and also to take snapshots. So I'm going to cover those very quickly. If we select the server itself, you see we have a backup option. Currently there aren't any there. I can do a quick backup now. Currently, my only place for storage is here locally. So I can do a backup right here on the existing machine, but ideally you want your backups to be off separate on a different machine. So I'm going to very quickly show you how I map my Synology NAS to be my source for image files and backups. Now your system's liable to be completely different, and you'll need to look at both your Proxmox and your NAS drive or whatever external storage you're using for more advice on how to do that. Over on my Synology, the first thing I did was I created a new share and called it Proxmox 03. I then created a Proxmox user and made sure that that user had full read-write permissions to this Proxmox folder. That's where we're going to store backup, container templates, or anything else related to Proxmox. Okay, now with that share created over on our Synology, now we want to come over here and add that to our Proxmox environment. And to do that, we want to go to the data center level because we want to add this storage and make it available to any VMs that are within this data center. So once I select the data center level, I'm going to go to storage and I'm going to select add. Now, what you select here will depend somewhat upon your own environment. I'm going to choose SMB and CIFS because I do want to be able to map a drive for this in Windows to make it easy for me to move files between servers if I need to. So I'm just going to give this a name. I'm going to call this is my second Synology, so I'm going to call this Synology 2. The server in this case is the actual IP address of my Synology, and I have a Proxmox user and its super secret password. And what it's actually going to do, you notice it actually logged in with that account and shows me the shares that are available. So that share that I just created is available here. I could restrict this to just the Proxmox node, so I'll go ahead and do that. Now I need to tell it what kind of things I'm going to store on here. I am going to have disk images, ISOs. I can select multiple things here. This is my backup file, and that's pretty much all I need, that all I'm going to store on the Synology. So collect that. I'll go ahead and click add. Now you see I have my Synology 2 available. Now if I go back over to my server level backups and I create a backup now, you now see I have an option to create that backup over on the Synology. While that's fine to create a kind of an ad hoc backup, we really want to schedule something that's going to run automatically that we don't have to think about. And to do that, we're going to go back over to the data center level, choose backup, and this is going to allow us to add a backup job. So in this case, select individual nodes, but since I only have one here, it's Proxmox 3, I'll just leave that. My storage, again, is going to be over on my Synology. If I had more than one VM, I could select the individual ones. I'm going to say also, if I add later VMs later, they will be picked up automatically. And they have some default options here, but this is customizable. So for right now, I'm just going to choose Monday through Friday. And I'm just going to say instead of midnight, 4 a.m. Okay, if I want, I can actually have it send me an email when it fails. I'm going to leave that blank for now. This is fine. And then the mode, each of these modes have different consistency or better consistency. Snapshot will basically take a snapshot of the system without taking Home Assistant down. Since I'm doing this at 4 in the morning, I'm going to go ahead and choose stop for mine, just because, again, Home Assistant will be down for, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 minutes tops, but it's 4 in the morning, so that's fine. If you don't want Home Assistant to go down, you could definitely choose snapshot here, but I'm going to leave that there. Go ahead and click create. And now I have a backup job created, so every Monday through Friday at 4 a.m. is going to take a backup of my entire VM, and it's going to copy that over to the Synology. One other thing I do want to do on this, though, I skipped, was retention. I don't want to fill up my Synology over time, so I don't want to keep all backups. Since I'm doing 5 weekly backups, I'll just say keep the last 5. I could also keep 1 daily, monthly, but that's good enough for me because we do have the Home Assistant backups as well. Okay, so now my job is created. And the one other thing I mentioned are snapshots, which are different from snapshots we just saw in the backup. A snapshot will allow us to save or freeze a machine in its exact state. And where you might use this would be possibly before you run a Home Assistant upgrade or you're doing something risky. It's very easy to do that. We select the server, go to snapshots. You'll see we're currently right here as now. All I've got to do is click take snapshot, give it a name, whether I want to include everything that's in RAM or not, and just say take snapshot. It's very quick. It only takes a couple of seconds. It doesn't affect Home Assistant running. It's perfectly fine there. So now we're done. So now I have a test snapshot right here. So if I go do something in Home Assistant and I blow the thing up, I can easily come back here to this and I can roll back to the state I was at that exact time. So snapshots are kind of those little quick ad hoc things where backups are the full system that you want to kind of keep off the system in case the entire server crashes. And what about your old version of Home Assistant? Well, here's my original Proxmox. And again, here was my original version. Notice it stopped. I'm going to let that sit for a few days just to make sure I don't have any problems with the new install. I would recommend, even if you're on a Raspberry Pi, the same thing. Shut down your Raspberry Pi, but keep it on standby. Should anything go wrong, then after a few days, maybe a week, you can repurpose that Raspberry Pi and do something else with it. But I'm going to keep this around just as a fallback position. The one thing in my case I need to do, since I am on Proxmox, I do need to select this, go to options, and I do want to disable this start on boot. If for some reason this server would reboot, I don't want this other identical instance of Home Assistant with the same MAC address and IP address starting. Once this is run for a while and I'm confident everything is fine on the new server, I can actually come in here and delete this VM and get rid of it and use this server for something else. So that's pretty much it. It was really pretty easy, and the whole process took maybe about an hour with a maximum of about 3 minutes of downtime for Home Assistant. You run an installer for Proxmox, run a couple of scripts, and restore your backup from Home Assistant. Now there's a lot more that Proxmox can do, including creating VMs and containers. It's a great test platform for just trying things out, and I would encourage you to learn more about Proxmox by watching some other tutorials that are available online. In addition, the one thing that I'm looking forward to is now that I have 3 Proxmox servers, I can create a cluster to create that high availability or failover for Home Assistant. That'll be coming up in a later video. But for now, that's going to do it. If you found anything in this video you liked or found helpful, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button. If you'd like to see more of my content and help support me, click that subscribe button and ding that little bell icon if you want to be notified when I release new videos. And as always, I'd like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.